Yeah, shall I start? Just give me a signal.
Yes, I'll definitely give you a signal. It's just buffering. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Legal eagles, luminaries, and learners, welcome. My name is Zubair, and I represent the Global Institute of Law, Oxford. Today, we would be joined by Dr. Muhammad Talib, who is a lecturer of anthropology at Oxford University. He taught for 22 years at Jamia Millia in India, and then for the past 20 years, he has been teaching anthropology at Oxford University. We are very pleased to have you with us, sir. Over to you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Zubair, and for this opportunity to share my thoughts. At the outset, let me just say that a very serious scholar or practitioner of law would not take anthropology very seriously. The reason is that the anthropological approach would actually upset, murky the settled water, and therefore it would be a kind of shift from one comfort zone to the other, and therefore most lawyers really won't like this. The basic starting point for anthropology of law is that law, first of all, is normally seen with respect to a very commonsensical view of law, which is that it consists of all that belongs to a particular institution or its established location. So law is equal to the statute books, the law books. There are certain institutions where this is practiced, and the common sense understanding gives us a view that lawyers generally speak from the legal text as if, or in much same way as perhaps a religious scholar would speak also from an established text. But to view it anthropologically would be to actually unpack this autonomous zone of law and take the view that law, there are certain conditions that made law possible. It could be a social movement, it could be a very engaged debate outside the law books and the legal institutions that codified a law, and there were certain considerations, problems that individuals face in society, and in many ways, law was part of that resolution. Also, this particular view has its own limits in the sense that it does give you an understanding of the very objectivist view that where is law coming from, and law is taken as a kind of a final destination of all those processes. But there is also the fact that those who are practicing law are part of an institution, and that there is an ethos, very extra legal in the sense that is not codified in the law books, but the lawyers and the advocates and judges and other important actors, they subscribe to it. And again, as a very casual observer, one would say that, look, in every situation, people would say there were extra legal considerations in the codification of a particular judgment. So judgment is not purely coming straight from the law book, but there are other considerations too. Now, this takes us to say that the subjectivist view of the institution from inside and the external objectivist conditions that make both possible, they together form a view of law where it is anchored in society, practiced in a certain institutional framework, and is determined not just by the reasons internal to law or internal to the institutions, but from outside as well. This takes us into the relationship between power and knowledge, which if deployed on this phenomenon of law, we would say that law is determined by outside institutions, but the law serves certain purpose in society in terms of order and control. There was a time, pre-industrial society, when law was the hallmark of law, and I'm drawing upon for this insight in Emile Durkheim's The Division of Labor. He says the hallmark, the characteristic feature of law in pre-industrial societies was its repressive characteristic. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, which means that if someone violates or is a deviant, moves away from law, then he's to be repressed, he's to be punished. And the understanding is that the part, if it's a part behavior, then the entire person is actually to be penalized. So you have horrible narratives about how prisoners were treated in medieval times or even earlier. So this is repressive. In industrial society, the focus of attention is not the body of the offender, but it's a complex matter. And therefore, the hallmark of law in industrial society is restitution, or restoring the recalcitrant, the deviant, the delinquent, back to the normal order to which the person belonged. And in this thinking about restoration, the act of the criminal doesn't make the entire body polluted, which is to be then cleaned, but that, and this is, there comes Foucault, that in the industrial society, because the scale of operation of law is huge, because of all sorts of factors that have gone into the transformation from the pre-industrial to the industrial, there is a huge population to be controlled. So while punishment and the law, they were focused on individuals, whether it's the monarch whose law is violated, and again, the culprit is to be penalized according to how it was felt by an individual. But here in the industrial society, there is knowledge generated about the person, so that, for example, if there's a murderer, then the focus of judgment may be very clear, but where is it coming from? It is based on knowledge about how, for example, how criminals are born in society. So there are sociologists which are objectifying the offender at the level of knowledge, and to say that a criminal act is not because of the criminal, but there's so many things that actually go together into creating the act into creating the criminal. So there are all sorts of views about how crime is produced in society through mechanisms which are social, cultural, and structural. In other words, whereas the earlier focus was on the body, the contemporary focus is on the soul of the offender. By soul, I mean the mind, the intellectual makeup that motivates somebody to act in a certain way. Let me, yeah. So the other thing is that another point, which is very important, that the contemporary law is unthinkable without a democratic setup. You might say, well, dictators also follow law. Well, I would say that there is a certain phenomenon of law which looks like law but is not law. Now, this is very tricky. Say, for example, a very powerful person, you can call the person sovereign dictator. Sovereign is a word that is misused in literature, but yes, to say that he could do whatever. And there is no rule of law, but rule by law. Law immediately is born to embellish the wishes of a dictator. Now, on the face of it, law as coming from the most powerful person may seem like law, but actually it is not law, but prosthetic or prosthetics of the dictator, meaning it is serving no larger principle, but only the wishes of the commander. And in this sense, while democracy places law in certain institutions, and the bearers of law are also in some sense the authors of that law, and here authorship is not in the sense of that they have formulated or codified, but they are part of that consensus in a by and large fashion. This broader enframing is upset when it is dictatorship and not democracy. You would have heard dictators saying, well, we don't, we are also very, very Democrats, and that law in our situation, in our context, takes its own course, as if law is a person, as if law has its own internal logic, which is above power considerations in a society. So as students of anthropology and anthropology of law, it is extremely important to understand law in the context of social and cultural determinations, and that law forever is embedded, although in its operation it may conceal or hide its anchoring in the wider context. It may appear autonomous, but it is embedded in the context of its own making. Usually, when institutions appear autonomous, it is only an effect. It is not a reality, because forever, these autonomous, seemingly autonomous institutions, which have a large operation or operation at a scale, they hide their embedding or their anchoring in the wider context. So it is extremely important to understand law in its wider ramifications. Otherwise, law is likely to be reified. It is likely to hide that entire constituency, which in a collective sense we'll call its author. So this much is as my starting point.
Thank you very much, Professor Talib. That has been fascinating. You have raised several important points. And if I were to highlight the key words in your presentation, so they are text, knowledge, violence, authority, autonomy. So here we see that law is basically all and nothing. As you said, that the lawyer's treatment of text is a theologian's treatment of the text, which is independent of the context. But still, we have realist school of law, which basically challenges these text-based understanding of law. Why do you think that lawyers hate anthropological perspective? I mean, why it's so difficult for them to comprehend it?
It's not just about lawyers. Even anthropologists, if they are asked to reflect on their own discipline, would not like to do that. It's almost, I mean, I think every discipline forms its own comfort zone, its own grids and its own framings, and it is tied to very specific institutional rewards. So there's really no time to move out of the orbits. It requires an extra bundle of energy to move away from your settled grids, and usually our very busy professional life doesn't allow us to look into the cracks, look into that little peephole in our institutions, because there's so many high rewards here.
I mean, this whole issue of navel gazing, right? So that we are trained in such a way that we have to start from certain assumptions.
Yeah.
Without those assumptions, our field cannot operate.
Yeah.
So for physicists, it was very difficult to imagine that there could be something which could be faster than speed of light. So you have to assume. Similarly, do you think that lawyers and anthropologists, they have to base their discipline on certain assumptions?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, Thomas Kuhn, who wrote about the revolution in science, there are certain normal sciences, which is the normal paradigm in which all of us work as scholars of belonging to specialized disciplines, and which has certain prescribed assumptions, methodologies, and even substantive truths. And in the normal course of either anthropology or, for that matter, other disciplines, we are pursuing our researches after much has already been clarified at the level of philosophy and theory. So we are not questioning that. There are two hazards in the pursuit of any discipline. One hazard is that the outcome of your research can actually question your own assumptions, and it might make you feel challenged, questioned, but so be it, because this is what science is all about. The outcome of knowledge can also question the powerful, the settled policy assumptions, the wider ethos in which society has been constituted. And therefore, usually these two hazards, the powerful being questioned, or the wider ethos being questioned, or the social scientists or the scientists being questioned by the outcomes, is not liked by most of us.
Dr. Talib, you're raising very, very interesting point, specifically about the issue of power. And here we know, and you just mentioned the nexus between power and knowledge. One of the Foucauldian insight is that power is not specific in individuals or institutions, rather it's dispersed, right? And it's also very dynamic. So when we say that power relations, what do we actually mean? Say, for instance, a person could be quite weak and vulnerable in one position, say, for instance, as an employee, but could be very powerful as a husband in home. So what we are talking about the power, are we looking into the dynamic relationship or dynamic concept of power?
Of course, I mean, power is very dynamic. And also, there is no set formula about power that this is how it would work. When it is in league with knowledge, knowledge is most of the time providing a context in which the powerful appears legitimized, justified. But at the same time, knowledge which serves power is not that knowledge which would last from one epoch to the other. In fact, this has to change its form after every project of power is done, so to say. I mean, to give you just one example, and it's a very broad brush, there was a time when Islamization was a very important cosmology, strategic cosmology. It helped in the implementation of the global operation in certain part of the world. But we didn't need Islamization after the project was over. And therefore, it became enlightened moderation or something which is not Islamization, something that was not ratifying or getting validated in the actions of Mujahideen. So there was in about a decade, this whole thinking changed. So this is the level of dynamism of knowledge and power, both interplay with each other. Knowledge is not a person. So again, power is not a person. Powerful is the person, and those who contribute to, or those who are part of the satellite or prosthetics of the powerful, they are scholars, individual scholars. And those scholars can, again, change from one position to the other. You can actually pick up on a given scholar and say that what was the trajectory of that person. And you might find people changing their views when they move from being the prosthetics of one powerful and then they become that of another. So the power also sort of vacillates. The knowledge also vacillates, or the scholars also vacillate in terms of their ideas, as much as the powerful requires that vacillation all the time. You were mentioning about someone who is powerful in one domain, but not powerful in the other. Family is a very obvious example, but even dictators. I mean, come to think of any dictator in African context, in Middle East, South Asia, these dictators appear very, very ferocious and powerful vis-a-vis their own constituency. But just Google and find, these dictators standing before greater hegemons. It could be the president of the United States, for example, and they look so obedient, and their body language is different, and they are trying to please the hegemon. So I mean, yes, powerful in one domain may not be powerful in another domain. And I always feel that these dictators who seem to be powerful, they are actually commissarial dictators. They are dependent sovereigns.
This is excellent. I think the example of dictator which you gave, and immediately Musharraf comes to mind. That when it comes to repressing people in Pakistan, he was a macho man. But when a telephone call came from Washington that are you with us or against us,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? He
Yeah.
completely surrendered. So
Yes.
that's very interesting. I think I just want to hear to hear more from you the difference between power and hegemony. So power,
Yeah.
it does not have to be applied. It's more the hegemony, the
Yeah.
fear
Yeah.
of power,
Yeah.
the fear
Sure.
of the violence. That is much
Absolutely.
more like
Yeah.
the call from Washington.
Yeah. 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 I mean, very important question. Hegemony is not a kind of ideas which have been eternally pronounced and they would hold like any scientific truth. No, that doesn't happen. Hegemony is to be created and recreated and refreshed. Sometimes we give a lot of uh, uh, good marks to the global powers, saying that, look, they periodically release their classified documents, and because they are ultimately for the truth. But actually, what happens is that when the power is over, they require new hegemony, and they have to discard the old one. In military terminology, you decommission your tools, you demobilize them or immobilize them. Again, knowledge in a similar way. Knowledge is also a tool, a discursive tool. Um, it is to be immobilized, it is to be decommissioned. And that process of decommissioning is when classified documents become declassified and we jump over it saying, oh, wow, what a feast. But it's actually a disused tool. Yeah.
Well, that's an excellent insight. Now, I think I just want to move from power to the related issue of violence. So you mentioned this evolutionary concept in legal anthropology. So Durkheim and then Henry Sommermain, that there were pre-modern societies and modern societies. So in modern societies, violence is not very physical. It's more restorative. But here I just want to draw your attention to one example that you gave about stoning of a woman for
Yeah.
adultery, and then pouring of B-52s, which actually kill hundreds and then thousands of people. And we'll talk more about the current situation in Afghanistan. But I want to hear more from you about the issue of violence and its modern forms and manifestations.
Thank you very much. I mean, this I think is an excellent question. I would say that uh, first of all, I don't like this narrative about modernization, this transition from tradition to modernity. I still don't understand what is modernity and what is tradition. What's so bad about modernity and what's so good about what's so bad about tradition and what's so good about modernity. Uh, I think as observers, as ethnographers, we have to go case by case and find out what the reality in fact is. Uh, Violence or any situation of violence, and we know there are so many. Violence is politics using other tools. Violence happens when the normal tools are disallowed to be used. There's a breakdown of communication. War is the ultimate heightened form of violence. And if I may quote from Clausewitz on war, I would say war, and you could read violence, is the continuation of politics by other means. And so therefore, every situation of violence is to be seen politically. That and the solution of that would also be political. It could never be violence with violence. I have not read any coherent, cogent social science perspective that justifies insurgency and counterinsurgency deadlock or interlocking. I think it is contrary to knowledge. It's contrary to social science understanding. I would say that if you were to counter violence, you have to open channels of communication for restoring the political process. This insurgency is a bit like drones being sent, an extension of the powerful, which is neither reflexive nor human. It is intended to efface the enemy in one brush. And then there is a discourse that justifies insurgency and counterinsurgency in very, as if it's the handiwork of policy or science. And the example that you were referring is an excellent example of how we continuously condone one aspect of violence but promote the other. And the example that comes to my mind is Taliban stoning a woman because she committed adultery. And that became almost the basis of toppling the government, the Taliban rule. And the video is that, which I shared with my students, that a woman is being stoned by men around. And it was a very, not a very nice video. It evokes violent emotions among the viewers. But I showed this video to my students, asking them, why is it that this video spurs so much of violent feelings? But when you hear news about cluster bombing, or even drone attacks, which may kill thousands in just one moment, why is it that that doesn't evoke as much repugnance as this video? And so my next question was that, is it that we naturalize and universalize certain tools of destruction, which are more scientific? And stone, obviously, is a very crude, it came from the Stone Age, and the use of it makes the person also belong to the Stone Age. Stone Age, by the way, was the word used, Stone Age, medieval times, etc., those who are indulging in that. So violence actually is something which is to be condemned, whether it is small or big. But it is to be understood scientifically, which is that it is actually blocked political process. To restore it or to counter it, you require the restoration of the political process.
Talib, here I want to draw your attention towards a type of violence which is passive. And let's take the example of COVID. So the loss of life that has happened because of COVID is no less than it was during the First World War and the Second World War. And Americans are even more affected. So why is it that the type of violence which actually challenge the existing political structures draws entirely different response than this type of corona violence, which actually in terms of loss of life is much more than it was during the war? Because here, China, even if we say that COVID actually started from China, is not trying to take over the world. So imagine if it were basically an invasion, and the loss of life should have been just a small segment of what has happened because of COVID. So the response should have been entirely different.
You are right that whenever destruction happens, killings happen, those who are survivors, they question as to why has it happened. And if they are able to actually track or identify a human agent, then that anger is more if they are able to say that, look, everybody was helpless, it happened independent of humans, then we condone it. Now, let me extend this COVID into another domain, which is poverty. Huge areas of poverty where people are malnourished, for example, their longevity is reduced. In social science terminology, one could actually connect this poor nutrition with vulnerability to high mortality, etc. That also is slow death caused entirely by the human policies. But because power and the policy and the way inequality and injustice is perpetrated, we tend to also evolve explanations and say, well, what can you do? This is how you are fated because, you were unfortunate, for example. Or, society by society, you would find different theodicies, different rationales about poverty, which could be construed as misfortune. So where there is a human agent, which one is able to identify, the anger is more, but where it is generalized and naturalized, the anger gets diffused. And it is for this reason that society forever requires hegemony, discourse, knowledge which continuously justifies the pursuit and projects of power, causing injustice and causing miseries.
This is excellent. Here, I just want to ask you a question about the relationship between religion, law, and politics. So we started off that how lawyers' perspective of law is that law is independent. At least this is the classical perspective, that law is independent of the context. Law is the law. This is the definition of law, right? But we see that, as you mentioned, that there are phenomena like law, including religion, including personal habits, or simply exercise of violence by a gunman who may stop you at nighttime in the street and ask you to hand over whatever you have with it, right? So this is not very, very different than state asking you to pay taxes. Or another example of where state actually, when they use electric chair for killing, that is a modern technique of disciplining and ensuring law and order. But if it's done through stoning, so that is primitive, that is Stone Age. So maybe you would like to comment on that?
I mean, look, state has monopoly over the use of instruments of killing, and not just monopoly, but it's also legitimized through law. So if it happens through the state, then there is a legal terminology that would explain that, yes, it has taken place, the killing was done for good reason. And in many societies, you would find very, very important leaders who were elected by the people, but they were not liked by the deep state. And they were killed, but they were killed only as part of a legal proceeding. People even call this term, this expression, judicial murder, is also part of that reasoning. Please bear in mind that law alone or no state alone can actually make law enforceable. No matter how the police that you have, the military, whatever, there is that large chunk of humanity which would forever either escape or is outside the actual capacity of the state to bring about discipline or order. So you need religion. And religion is most of the time an ally of the state. And here ally doesn't mean that there was some conference that was held or the Congress and both became close to each other. but that religion more or less serves that purpose which law on the other side is trying to see in reality or implement in reality. So Foucault would call it self-fashioning. There is a technology of the self where people use it to bend or to comply, and comply not because of law, but because of the creator, for example, by faith. And ultimately, this, from a purely statist angle, this self-fashioning is in league or is as an ally of the institution that disciplines.
I think in our talk, Weber has been the elephant in the room. So Weber's classification of charismatic personality into religious, or it could be a warrior, it could be a leader. So what we see that there is this interaction between soft and hard power. So the soft power of religion, based on persuasion, trying to control your faith, your ideas, your mind, and the hard power of violence, basically power, right? So we see a complex interaction there. So would you like to comment on that?
I mean, I've always felt that soft power, in fact, is the hardest. And the hard power is forever a slave of the soft power. Take the example of drone. Drone as a technology, the person who pulls the trigger, never kills. It is the technology that kills, but that's more of an illusion. Whether it's drone or, in a larger sense, the prosthetics of power, but they require the command from the powerful. And therefore, I have always felt that technology or even law, one could draw parallels between the two. They look like means to ends, to given ends. They seem to be doing something, and the person who ordered may appear autonomous, different, distanced, but actually it was a soft power that commanded, that directed the instrument into doing what was done, which is killing.
Great, thank you very much. तो तालिब साहब, ये तो हमने अपनी ग्लोबल ऑडियंस के लिए बात की. अब हम थोड़ा सा उर्दू में बात करते हैं, क्योंकि हमारी काफी ज्यादा ऑडियंस जो है वो साउथ एशिया में है, तो वो इसको समझ सकेंगे. तो एंथ्रोपोलॉजी इल्म बशरियात और जो सोशियोलॉजी है वो इल्म समाजी इल्म, तो ये डिस्टिंक्शन क्यों क्या की जाती है ना एंथ्रोपोलॉजी और सोशियोलॉजी में?
एंथ्रोपोलॉजी और सोशियोलॉजी का फर्क कुछ इस तरह से समझिए कि जब यूरोप में इंडस्ट्रियल रेवोल्यूशन आया तो समाज में बहुत बड़ी तब्दीली आई, और अभी सोशियोलॉजी पैदा भी नहीं हुई. समझिए, हम अगर बात करें 19th सेंचुरी को सामने रखते हुए, तो नई रियलिटीज निकल के आ रही थी, शहर बन रहे थे. ये कहते हैं कि जो बूर्जुआजी और प्रोलेटारिएट दो लफ्ज हैं, ये इंडस्ट्रियल रेवोल्यूशन के बाद के लफ्ज हैं. बहुत सारी रियलिटीज थी जिनका नाम नहीं दिया गया था, जिनको समझाया नहीं गया था कि ये आई कहाँ से. अर्बेनिज्म, अर्बन, इंग्लैंड में और यूरोप में आमतौर से ये हुआ कि जो पेजेंट्री है, वो जो भी वजह रही हो, उसका एक मूवमेंट, पॉपुलेशन का ट्रांसफर हम देखते हैं फ्रॉम द कंट्री साइड टू द सिटीज. उसमें नए नए किस्म के क्राइम्स निकल के आए, इंडिविजुअलिज्म बढ़ा, कम्युनिटी टूटी. तो एक तकाजा था, एक जरूरत थी समाज की कि वो ये समझा जाए कि ये हो क्या रहा है. What exactly is this? How to understand this transformation? How to understand this social change? And sociology emerged as an intellectual response कि हम ये समझ सकें कि समाज की तब्दीली कैसे हो रही है, कौन से ड्राइवर्स हैं इसके, कहाँ से बात निकल रही है और कहाँ तक पहुंच रही है. یہ تو ہوئی بات سوشیولوجی کی. اب اینتھروپولوجی کا یہ ہوا کہ جب یورپ پھیل رہا ہے انڈسٹریل ریولوشن کی وجہ سے, اس کا پروڈکشن سسٹم کچھ کا کچھ ہو گیا, تو اب وہ نان یورپین سماج میں داخل ہوتا ہے تھرو کولونیلزم, تھرو ادر ویز آف ٹریڈ اینڈ کنیکشنز. تو اب جو نئی باتیں سامنے آئیں وہ یہ تھی کہ ہمیں زبانی سمجھ, ہم اپنے سامان کیسے بیچیں گے, اپنے آکوپیشن بھی کیسے کریں گے اگر ہم سمجھیں گے نہیں زبان کو, لوگوں کی زبان, لوگوں کا کلچر, طریقے, کیا انہیں پسند ہے, کیا انہیں پسند نہیں ہے. میں اس کی آپ کو ایک چھوٹی سی مثال دوں گا, کتنی امپورٹنٹ بات تھی. یہ سوڈان کا قصہ ہے پرانا, کہ جس میں کوئین کا ایک ایمبیسڈر پہنچتا ہے اور ایک ٹرائبل چیف سے اس کی ملاقات ہوتی ہے, اور وہ ٹرائبل چیف اس کو جو گولڈن سٹول ہے, جو سب سے ہائی پوائنٹ آف لیجیٹیمیسی ہے, اس پر بیٹھنے کو نہیں کہتا بلکہ ایک عام سی کرسی کے اوپر بیٹھنے کو کہتا ہے. وہ اس کو بہت برا لگا اور اس نے کہا کہ یہ تو حکم عدولی ہے اور ہم اس پہ جنگ کریں گے. تو یہ مشہور قصہ ہے کہ جس پر اینتھروپولوجسٹ نے بتایا کہ آپ یہ شخص, یہ جو کرسی دی گئی تھی گولڈن سٹول, یہ دراصل مذہبی اس کا ایک اس کی سگنیفیکنس ہے, اور یہ کسی اور کو دی بھی نہیں جا سکتی, اس لیے کوئی اس میں حکم عدولی نہیں ہے, یہ عقیدے کا مسئلہ ہے. In other words, anthropology emerged as an intellectual response to understand the other. So sociology was an attempt to understand the self, anthropology was an attempt to understand the other. اور یہ ادر جو تھا یہ یورپین ادر تھا. اس کو شروع میں پریمیٹیو کہا گیا, پھر لوگوں نے شرم دلائی کہ دیکھو یار پریمیٹیو کیا چیز ہوتی ہے, تو غرض یہ اور بیکورڈ کہا گیا. پھر یہ کلاسیفیکیشن اور آگے چلتا گیا, یہ ڈیولپنگ سوسائٹیز ہوئی, یہ تھرڈ ورلڈ ہوا. مطلب اگر آپ لاہور کی فوڈ اسٹریٹ کو انڈیکس مانیں تو, اور کھانے کے ذائقے کو انڈیکس مانیں تو پاکستان فرسٹ ورلڈ کہلانا چاہیے. لیکن جب آپ کرائٹیریا بدل دیں گے, ٹیکنالوجی پہ آئیں گے, جی ڈی پی پہ آئیں گے, اور دیگر ایبلٹی ٹو ایکسٹریکٹ پہ آئیں گے, یا ٹریڈ کی ڈومیننس پہ آئیں گے, تو ظاہر سی بات ہے کہ پھر وہ نومنکلیچر بدل جائے گا, وہ ٹیکسانومی بدل جائے گی. تو میرے حساب سے sociology was an attempt to understand what was happening to the self as a consequence of industrial revolution, or anthropology was an attempt to understand the other as a result of the expansion of Europe in non-European societies.
اوکے, یہ ہمیں ایک ڈاکٹر داؤد سلیم فاروقی صاحب نے ایک سوال پوچھا ہے فیس بک کے اوپر. I assume that the talk is about anthropological metamorphosis of law in modern perspective. Since law is there to propagate the function morality, how political violence could be explained in terms of moral maturity, as Carl Jung and Lawrence Kohlberg advocate that morality is the process of maturation of humans.
میں مطلب میچوریشن کا لفظ میں سمجھتا ہوں, لیکن اس کا ایٹریبیوشن میں ہی سمجھ میں نہیں آیا کہ کون میچور اور کون میچور نہیں.
تو بیسیکلی ہم نے ریلیجن اور لا کا تو ریلیشن شپ ڈسکس کیا. وہ پوچھے ہم اس سے رہے ہیں کہ ریلیجن اور موریلٹی کا جو 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 کانسیپٹ ہے, پوری کی پوری جو ڈیبیٹ ہے لا اینڈ موریلٹی کی, کہ جی کیا ایک لا جو ہے وہ اگر امورل لا ہے وہ اسٹل مورل ہوگا, اور جو موریلٹی ہے کیا وہ انفورسبل ہو سکتی ہے.
لیکن میں صرف یہ تو ایک بہت ہی نوانس سوال ہے. میں یہ کہوں گا on the strength of what anthropologists, sociologists normally say, is that what is shared and accepted is moral. اب میں آپ کو بتاؤں کہ جو دنیا ہے وہ اتنی کمپلیکس ہے, اور اس کا ڈویژن آف لیبر اتنا کمپلیکس ہے کہ یہ بالکل ممکن ہے کہ میں بالکل سفید لباس پہنے ہوئے, چہرے پہ بہت نور, with all the claims to morality, اور میری جو فارن پالیسی ہے وہ اتنی باربیرک ہے کہ جہاں وہاں جو کچھ بھی ہو رہا ہے وہ اس کو کسی مورل ایتھیکل پرنسپل پہ جسٹیفائی نہیں کیا جا سکتا. تو یہ ہیومینٹی کے بارے میں جو اسایا برلن نے کہا کہ یہ ایک ایسا کروکٹ ٹمبر ہے جس کو انسانیت کہتے ہیں کہ جس میں سے آج تک کوئی سیدھی چیز نکلی ہی نہیں. اور خصوصاً یہ جو کمپلیکس ڈویژن آف لیبر ہے دنیا کا, اس میں معلوم نہیں کیا مورالیٹی ہے اور کیا ایتھکس ہے اور کیا میچوریشن ہے. یہ نہیں کہ آپ کا سوال نامناسب ہے, بہت امپورٹنٹ سوال ہے, لیکن میں ایکچولی ایتھنوگرافر ہوں, مجھے پالیسی اور اس کے بارے میں زیادہ علم نہیں.
تو طالب صاحب جو بیسک ایک امپورٹنٹ کوشچن یہاں پر یہ ہے کہ جو یہ کلاسیفیکیشن ہے نالج کی کہ جی یہ اینتھروپولوجیکل پرسپیکٹیو, یہ سوشولوجیکل پرسپیکٹیو, یہ لیگل پرسپیکٹیو, یہ پولیٹیکل پرسپیکٹیو, یہ اکنامک پرسپیکٹیو, جو فینومینا جس کو ہم پڑھ رہے ہیں وہ تو اس سے انڈیپینڈنٹ ہے نا کہ ہم کون سا پرسپیکٹیو ہم لیتے ہیں. جس بھی سوشل فینومینا کو یا نیچرل فینومینا کو ہم سمجھنے کی کوشش کر رہے ہیں وہ تو اس پر سبجیکٹ نہیں کرتا نا کہ آپ کی ٹریننگ ایز اے لائر ہوئی ہے یا اینتھروپولوجسٹ ہوئی ہے نا. So why have these disciplines? Don't you think that it's creating so many problems that even people train in different disciplines can't communicate with each other?
بالکل صحیح بات ہے. مطلب کہتے ہیں کہ ریالٹی یا حقیقت جو ہے وہ ایک ہے, اور آپ اس کو الگ الگ ٹولز اور میتھڈالوجی سے دیکھ رہے ہیں جو الگ الگ ڈسپلنس کی ہو سکتی ہے. یہ جو انسولیشن ہے یا ایک دوسرے سے بیگانگی اور علیحدگی ہے, یہ انسٹیٹیوشنلی انجینئرڈ بھی ہے, اور ساتھ ہی ساتھ میں یوں کہنا چاہیے کہ سماج کا جو سفر ہے وہ ہر وقت مسلسل نہیں ہوتا. کہیں کہیں لوگ پڑاؤ کر جاتے ہیں اور بھول جاتے ہیں کہ ہم یہاں کس مقصد کے تحت پہنچے, چاہے وہ سوشیولوجی ہو, چاہے وہ لا ہو, کوئی اور ڈسپلن ہو. اصولی بات تو یہ ہونی چاہیے کہ یہ برابر دیکھنا چاہیے کہ ہمارے ڈسپلنز جو ہیں وہ لوکل کانٹیکس میں ریلیونٹ بھی ہیں یا نہیں ہیں. آپ کو میں ایجوکیشن کی ایک پرورسٹی بتاؤں کہ دوسرے اور پروسیسز جو ہیں جو اتنے حاوی آ جاتے ہیں ڈسپلنس پر, کہیں کموڈیفیکیشن ہو جاتا ہے ڈسپلن کا, کہیں پہ صرف یہ ہوتا ہے کہ صاحب the whole acquisition of knowledge becomes a means to an end. کہ یونیورسٹیز میں بھی جب کسی نے شکایت کی کہ صاحب اس یونیورسٹی میں تو فلاں قوم کو زیادہ مطلب پریفر کیا جاتا ہے اور فلاں کو ایکسکلوڈ کر دیا جاتا ہے, تو اس کا کسی نے جواب دیا کہ بھئی دیکھیے قومیں جو ہیں وہ کئی 100 سال میں بنتی ہیں, اور اب یہی جو جن کو پریفر کیا جا رہا ہے اور جو نااہل ہیں کل کو اہل ہو جائیں گے. تو کوئی بھی جسٹیفیکیشن دے کے ہم کسی بھی انسٹیٹیوشن کو جسٹیفائی کر سکتے ہیں, لیکن اصل میں سوسائٹی کو ہمیں ایک سفر کے استعارے میں بھی دیکھنا چاہیے, اور اس استعارے میں بھی دیکھنا چاہیے کہ یہ جو ہمارے علوم ہیں جن پر سماج کا پیسہ خرچ ہوتا ہے, یونیورسٹیز میں پیسہ خرچ ہوتا ہے, ٹیکس پیئرز کا پیسہ جاتا ہے, اور ان لوگوں کا بھی جاتا ہے جو اس کے بینیفیشری نہیں ہوتے, تو ہم پر یہ تقاضا بہت زیادہ ہوتا ہے کہ ہم ان پرابلمس کو لیں بلا تفریق ڈسپلنس کے, اور پھر یہ کہیں کہ الگ الگ ڈسپلنز ان پرابلمس کو کیسے دیکھتی ہیں. مثال کے طور پہ غریبی ہے, انیکوالٹی ہے, انجسٹس ہے, سوشل ایکسکلوژن ہے, اس کی طرف کوئی دھیان ہی نہیں دیتا, کہیں پہ بھی نہیں دیتا. میل نیوٹریشن ہے, پانی کی کمی ہے, گراؤنڈ واٹر جو ہے وہ نیچے کی طرف جا رہا ہے, مثال کے طور پہ بہت معمولی سی بات ہے, لیکن جب آپ اس کو الگ الگ ڈسپلنس کے حساب سے دیکھیں گے تو پتہ چلے گا کہ یہ تو سماجی پرابلم ہے جس کو ایک پوری ڈائیورسٹی ہے ڈسپلنس کی, کہ جن کو بلا کے پوچھنا چاہیے کہ آپ اپنے اپنے طور پر بتائیے کہ اس کو ہم کیسے سالو کریں. تو یہ میتھڈالوجی ایریا اسٹڈیز میں تو استعمال ہوئی فار کمپلیٹلی ادر پروجیکٹس. مطلب جو گلوبل ڈومیننس کے لیے پتہ چلا کہ لوگ ایجپٹ پہنچ گئے کہیں, مثال کے طور پہ, یا کوئی اور سماج بھی ہو سکتا ہے, اور وہاں پہ مختلف ڈسپلن والوں سے کہا جا رہا ہے کہ صاحب آپ بتائیے پولیٹیکل سائنس, اینتھروپولوجی, سوسیولوجی, کیمسٹری, زولوجی. اگر آپ نیپولن کے قصے پڑھیں تو وہ جب گیا تھا اپنے سولجرز کے ساتھ تو اپنے ساتھ بہت سارے سیونٹس کو لے کے گیا تھا, جن کو جو بیسیکلی الگ الگ اسکالرس تھے, آرٹسٹ بھی تھے اس کے اندر, ہائیڈرولوجسٹ بھی تھے, بوٹانسٹ بھی تھے, وغیرہ وغیرہ. اور وہ سب سے کہتا تھا کہ تم سب لوگ بتاؤ کہ مجھے کیا کرنا چاہیے. خیر وہ تو ایک پرورس ایگزامپل ہے, میں ویسا نہیں کہہ رہا, لیکن وہ بہرحال اس کا جو پروجیکٹ تھا اس کے حساب سے اس نے کیا. لیکن نیشنل پروجیکٹ میں سمجھتا ہوں بہت بڑا پروجیکٹ ہے جس میں ہر ملک کو اپنے طور پر اس طرح دیکھنا چاہیے نالج کو ایک ڈائیورسٹی اور ملٹی پرسپیکٹیوزم ملٹی ڈسپلنیرٹی کے تناظر میں.
بات جو ہے دوسری طرف نکل جائے گی، لیکن وہ آپ نے جو نیپولین کی ایگزامپل دی اس سے مجھے اکبر کے 9 رتن یاد آ گئے. جو 9 رتن ہوتے تھے وہ بھی تو ایکسپرٹس اپنی اپنی فیلڈ کے تھے.
بالکل 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 صحیح کہہ رہے ہیں آپ. وہ 9 رتن جو تھے وہ لیکن 9 رتن جو تھے ان کو گویا ایک لمیٹڈ یونیورسلزم کا حصہ تھے وہ. یعنی مونارک کو اپنے تاج میں ہیرے بھی چاہیے تھے اور ساتھ ہی ساتھ میں کچھ دعوے بھی علم کے، کیونکہ علم کے دعوے کے بغیر پاور کام نہیں کرتی. وہ بہت ہی بھیانک ایک مکروہ شکل دکھائی دیتی ہے اگر اس کو علم کے پاؤڈر لپسٹک سے نہ زیبائش کی جائے اس کی.
نہیں، اس میں سے بالکل آئی تھنک آئی ایم ویری کانشیس کہ ٹائم ہمارے پاس کم ہے، بٹ یہ آخری سوال کہ جو پوری کی پوری جو جسٹیفیکیشن تھی کلونیلزم کی، پہلے تو جو سویلائز کرنا نا دنیا کو، حالانکہ وی نو کہ جن جن ایریاز کو وہ کنٹرول کر رہے تھے they were in many ways far more sophisticated, far more civilized than ایسٹ انڈیا کمپنی. ٹھیک ہے. اور پھر جو اب جو اس کی ماڈرن ٹرانسفارمیشن ہے، ہیومن رائٹس کا پورا ڈسکورس ہے، اور جو طالبان کو آؤسٹ کرنے میں آفٹر 9/11 تو پوری کی پوری آرگومنٹ یہی تھی. اور جو پورے کا پورا اب جو تھرڈ ورلڈ ہے وہ ہمیشہ ایک طرح کے اس فیئر میں رہتا ہے کہ جی ہم تو ہیومن رائٹس کو پورے نہیں کر رہے. ٹھیک ہے. جبکہ جو ہیومن رائٹس کے ٹارچ بیئررز ہیں ان کے اپنے آپ حالات دیکھیے، the way black lives are dealt with, right, اور other minorities are dealt with. So جو جسٹیفیکیشن ہے وہ آپ کی بات بالکل درست ہے کہ وہ علم کی بیس پر ہوتی ہے، بٹ وہ اتنا فلوئڈ ہے کہ کوئی بھی پاورفل جو ہے وہ آ کے کنٹرول کرنے کے بعد کوئی علماء اور یا اسکالرس کو جو ہے وہ اپنے ساتھ رکھے اور کہے کہ جی now give me the story why I'm ruling these people.
میں نے ایک بالکل اینیکڈوٹل بات سے شروع کروں میں کہ ایک اپنے بہت قریبی دوست انڈیا میں ان سے، وہ جو میرے بچپن کے بھی ساتھی تھے لیکن پھر بعد میں بہت بڑے آدمی ہو گئے، پاورفل ہو گئے. میں نے ان سے پوچھا، میں نے کہا تم یہ بتاؤ کہ تم اپنے اتنی بڑے عملے کو کیسے ہینڈل کرتے ہو، کوئی 5,000 لوگوں کو، اور سب تمہارے محکوم بھی رہتے ہیں. تو اس نے کہا کہ میرے پاس کچھ نہیں، ایک چھوٹا سا فارمولا ہے، اور یہ بھی اس نے مجھے قسمیں دلا دی کہ کسی سے ذکر مت کیجیے گا. وہ یہ کہ میں ہر ایک سے یہ سوال پوچھتا ہوں کہ ہاؤ کین یو ڈو اٹ بیٹر. تو ہر ایک بیچارہ شرمندہ سا ہو جاتا ہے اور پھر اب بتاتا ہے بڑی محنت کر کے کہ اب ہم کو یہ کرنا ہے. پورا کولونیلزم کے پروجیکٹ میں سوشل ریفارم ایک کنٹینیوس استعارہ ہے کہ جب آپ ٹھیک ٹھاک ہو جائیں گے تو پھر ہم چلے جائیں گے. ابھی آپ کے طور طریقے جو ہیں نا بہت باربیرک ہیں، بڑے وحشیانہ ہیں، اور اس کی بہت ساری مثالیں بھی ہمارے پاس ہیں، کیونکہ ہمارے پاس ایسے لوگ ہیں جو اسٹڈی کر سکتے ہیں آپ کو. اور نتیجے کے طور پر جہاں جہاں آکوپیشن ہوا، جہاں جہاں کلونیل پریزنس تھی، وہاں سوشل ریفارم کا ایجنڈا بہت ہائی تھا. میں آپ کو بتاؤں کہ ہیومن رائٹس ہو، ویمنز ایجوکیشن ہو، کسی کا بھی کچھ ہو، اب ایک نیا فیشن یہ نکلا ہے کہ کسی بھی انڈیویجول کو سمبل بنا دیجئے کسی بھی چیز کا، چاہے ہیومن رائٹس کا چیمپئن بنا دیجئے یا لڑکیوں کے ایجوکیشن کا، اور اس کو خوب پمپ کر دیجئے بری طریقے سے. وہ ایک چلتا پھرتا سوشل ریفارم کا استعارہ ہے، a walking metaphor, a walking model of social reform. اور اس سے نیمنگ اور شیمنگ صرف نکلتی ہے. وہ ہائرارکی اسٹیبلش ہوتی ہے کہ جن کا ڈسکورس ہے وہ اونچے ہیں، جن کے اوپر اس ڈسکورس کا اطلاق ہو رہا ہے وہ نیچے ہیں، اور اس طرح گلوبل ہائرارکی جو ہے وہ مینٹین ہوتی ہے.
طالب صاحب آپ نے مینشن کر دیا تو میں آپ سے جو ایک تھوڑا سا مشکل سوال پوچھنا چاہتا ہوں کہ ملالہ اور جو گریٹا تھنبرگ ہیں، ٹھیک ہے، آپ نے استعارے کی بات کی. ایک استعارہ جو ہیں وہ ایجوکیشن کا ہیں، ٹھیک ہے، اور لڑکیوں کی امپاورمنٹ کا ہے. دوسرا استعارہ جو ہے وہ انوائرمنٹ کا ہے، رائٹ. ایک کو جو ہے وہ ریکگنیشن اس طرح سے ملی کہ نوبل پرائز بھی ملا اور ہمیشہ نیوز میں اس کو ہونا ہوتا ہے. آپ نے دیکھا ہوگا ایک پیٹرن ہے کہ کبھی وہ جو ہے وہ ملالہ کو نیوز سے آؤٹ نہیں ہونے دیتے. کبھی نہ کبھی کسی نہ کسی طرح سے ایوری few months she has to be in the news, right, for good or bad reason. But then Greta Thunberg, if the argument is that Malala was a kind of imposed symbol, what about Greta Thunberg?
देखिए, आपने किसी भी हाकिम और बहुत मालदार आदमी के पास बहुत सारे गैजेट्स देखे होंगे. कुछ का वो इस्तेमाल करता है, कुछ का इस्तेमाल नहीं करता है. जब जरूरत पड़ती है तो उसका भी इस्तेमाल कर लेता है कि जब वो फिलहाल इस्तेमाल ना हो रहा हो. एनवायरनमेंट का इशू जो है उसका एनवायरनमेंट से कोई ताल्लुक नहीं, और एजुकेशनल रिफॉर्म का एजुकेशन से कोई ताल्लुक नहीं. जब ये एनवायरनमेंट की समिट्स होती हैं, उसका मकसद हरगिज ये नहीं होता कि कैसे हम उन लोगों को जो परपेट्रेटर्स हैं उनको बांधें, बल्कि कैसे हम उन लोगों को उस दायरे में ना आने दें कि जो परपेट्रेटर्स का दायरा है. लॉ का मकसद भी यही होता है और उन कन्वेंशन का मकसद भी यही होता है. अब मुझे मालूम नहीं, ग्रेटा थर्मर को अगर क्लोजली आप उसकी ट्रैजेक्टरी को देखें तो इसका कहीं ना कहीं इस्तेमाल जरूर होगा. मैं ये समझता हूँ कि नीरो ने जब बांसुरी बजाई थी, सॉरी बांसुरी नहीं, वो कुछ और इंस्ट्रूमेंट था, बांसुरी तो शायद गलत इंस्ट्रूमेंट हो, म्यूजिकल इंस्ट्रूमेंट, तो वो उस वक्त हो रहा था जब रोम जल रहा था. वो म्यूजिकल अपनी राग पे लगा हुआ था. स्कॉलरशिप जो है, और फॉर दैट मैटर डिस्कोर्स, या जो लोगों को क्रिएट किया जाता है, वो एक तरह से इंस्टेंट म्यूजिकल सिम्फनी होती है उस कॉन्टेक्स्ट में कि जब हर चीज जो है वो बर्बादी की तरफ और किलिंग्स की तरफ होती है. एनवायरमेंटल डिस्ट्रक्शन में आपने ग्रेटा थंबर्ग तैयार कर दी, एजुकेशनल बैकवर्डनेस में आपने मलाला तैयार कर दी. बहरहाल मलाला तो खैर एक इस्तेहार है, और भी बहुत से लोग हो सकते हैं. वाई पिक ऑन मलाला. मलाला को ज़ाती तौर पर मैं बहुत पसंद करता हूँ, ज़ाती तौर पर.
Thank you very much, Talib साहब. That has been fascinating. और काफ़ी ज़्यादा लोगों ने हमें ज्वाइन किया फेसबुक पर, हम उनके भी शुक्रगुजार हैं, और हम आपके बहुत ज़्यादा शुक्रगुजार हैं that you spare time from your precious moment.
My pleasure too. I thoroughly enjoyed the whole thing, except that I wasn't as much prepared as I should have been.
I think you were much more prepared, and that is evident by the engagement of our audience from all over the world. And hopefully, we will invite you again, and we will continue where we have just ended.
It will be my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.